We want to thank B&H Academic for their generous support of this episode. In the show notes below, you can find links to B&H and to other books by Trevin. Thanks for watching. My guest today is my old friend, Dr. Trevin Wax, publisher at Lifeway and the author of many great books, including Eschatological Discipleship. We discuss this and a lot of other fun ideas on this great episode.
Coffee, theology.
Okay. So I did bring you. Oh, but you're not a coffee drinker. All right, so forget
And my
this.
wife is.
All right, good. Okay,
No,
I was just going to throw it in the back.
Yeah,
All right,
no,
so it's Sooner Goss's Southern Blend. You may have had it before, but
that looks great.
how long has it been since you lived in Louisville?
We lived there from July of 2005 until January of 2007.
Okay.
So,
I
yeah.
was thinking that your first semester was my first semester as a professor.
Is
I'm
that the
pretty sure
case?
fall
I
of
didn't take you. I
2000.
didn't take you that semester though.
I had you in shepherding group. Do you remember that?
Oh, that's
Changed your
right.
life, obviously.
That's right.
So you may not remember this because obviously you didn't remember that you were in my shepherding group.
I forgot.
That's okay.
No, I do remember
I totally
that.
don't care. It was a long time ago,
that.
man. So,
but I did take you for Sermon on the Mount
You came,
in
I
a
think
J
you came
term.
back or
yeah,
something.
that was after.
Right.
Yeah, and I preached 35 sermons from that class, like having learned from that class.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I went back and for a whole year on Wednesday
whole
nights with our
year?
church.
Wow.
We went through Sermon on the Mount, basically through a lot of my study from that
And
class.
that was,
So,
I think, the very first time I taught it too, 2010, I think, or something like that.
Yours was one of my very favorite classes at Southern. If I had to
Good answer.
pick
Okay. Great. Well, that's why I had you on the show. I've been
you've been wanting
fishing
me
for
to say that.
moment.
Right, you've been wanting me to say that.
We will just randomly drive and see what happens.
You know what it's like when people ask you questions about stuff you wrote a long time ago?
Well, there is
And
that.
you know, and as if it's as fresh,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
right, you know.
And even if a book has just come out, it's probably been a year. Although you guys are, B&H is probably a little faster than some of the.
Well, for me, eschatological discipleship was my dissertation. So I actually wrote,
it was?
I wrote This Is Our Time. Well, I made it
obviously,
more
right.
readable for academic
realize
purposes.
that.
But
Okay.
This Is Our Time, actually, I wrote after eschatological discipleship, and it
Okay.
came out a year before.
Okay, well, let's
that's kind of weird.
Yeah,
you know,
okay,
to-
that helps my understanding. Let's come back to that. Well, the question that I like to ask everybody, because you've seen a few episodes.
First car?
Yeah, first car.
Was a
You had time to fabricate your answer.
1988 white Buick Park Avenue.
All right.
It was basically the first
That was
car.
you still drive? You're a Park Avenue kind of guy?
It was the first car that my parents bought new, and I think they bought it new. They never bought any other cars new. It was generally always, a couple years old.
Right.
But they bought this one, and by the time I was starting to drive, which was like 97, 98.
Okay, yeah. So
it was up there in miles.
Sure.
And all that. So we drove it into the ground. I had Grandma's car before it was Grandma's car, and then I bought another car from Grandma. Right. So it's like the
Park Avenue.
It's like the dorkiest answer ever.
Okay. Hey Siri, give me a number between 1 and 223.
12.
That's right. We didn't want you to stack the deck, because now with the random chapter reading really has to be random. So, Eschatological Discipleship.
Oh, my book. I would have picked a different one than 12, but I don't know what's on 12, so we'll see.
Well, that's why I didn't want you to.
What am I supposed to do?
Sorry, read a paragraph from it.
Okay.
With joy.
Let's see. Okay, so why do these dimensions of a worldview matter? Because people matter. And if one is to get to know people in their efforts to present the gospel, they must take their belief systems seriously. Worldviews matter for both the calling of disciples. Believers should know and love other people in order to be effective in sharing the gospel. And in the formation of disciples, believers should be transformed by the renewing of their minds as they seek to follow Christ.
Okay.
That's actually a pretty good summary of
Good.
like
You're happy with
why
that?
do you do like cultural analysis? Well, because people are formed by culture, and we are called to share the gospel, so we want to be effective in how we share the gospel, and we're also called to be disciples, and we need to know how we are formed both in good ways and bad ways by culture and by society in order to be disciples. So, well done, Siri.
Right.
Well done.
Why don't you say something about this? I'm very curious that it had its origins in your dissertation, which I did not realize, but
yes,
which does explain some of the the depth of the analysis. In fact, I guess, well, let me ask a question first, then you can give a thesis of it. Like, who's the audience of this book? Because I'll just say that it was not what I thought the book was going to be.
Well, tell me what you thought the book was going to be. Because that's really intriguing.
Yeah.
For you to like know what your expectations.
Which is good. I mean by that, I really enjoyed the book, and it's gonna sound better than I thought it was gonna. I don't mean that negatively. I mean,
I thought I was going to hate it.
no, I just mean I think the title, Eschatological Discipleship, knowing your work, both at Lifeway and just your engagement with culture through blogging and things.
Yeah.
I thought that it was going to be at a more lay level, not that it's
More
not
accessible.
readable,
Yeah.
but I actually just was very pleased with the depth of the analysis of things. And then as I started to read it, I went back and looked at the subtitle again and thought, and that kind of confirmed that, like, that's an odd subtitle if it was a popular level book. What's the subtitle again? Like
leading Christians to understand their historical and cultural context.
So then I was like, okay, that makes a little bit more sense.
Well, and you notice B&H Academic
and it is
published
academic
rather than B&H.
The fault is all mine, I'm sure. It just
well,
wasn't what I expected it to be. Again, I really enjoyed, and either of those books would have been great. I mean, a more popular level book on discipleship from you would be great, but this also was really good. So why don't you tell us?
Well,
how it came to be?
so the way I look at this is all of the actual academic underpinnings for This Is Our Time.
Okay.
Which is the book that I've written that has.
That did really
I think
well.
it's done the best, and but it is accessible. Like, I don't even think I use the term. I don't think I even use like the term eschatology or worldview or anything like that in it.
Okay. So you identify 4 elements in the intro: discipleship, worldview, eschatology, and wisdom.
Yeah. Wisdom's a big one in there, I think.
Yeah, and the whole thing is very, at the end of the day, very wisdom-oriented.
Right.
Kind of the idea of knowing your time and your place. That's the brilliance of the wisdom model, as opposed to, say, a pietistic or
just a
deontological,
rules-based,
or rules-based kind of morality. Is that really the Bible is calling us to wisdom, as you know. I care about that too.
But habits do help form wisdom, so habits matter.
Right.
So rules do matter. Like, there's a place for all of the other.
And we also believe in revelation.
That's right.
I mean, that's the big difference. It's a revelatory wisdom ethic, is what I would describe the Bible's sort of ethics. But so yeah, and just so much good in the book in terms of partly because you're reading all the people that I love to read too. Bartholomew Goheen, Tom Wright, Oliver O'Donovan.
Like, oh yeah.
I mean, tons of
O'Donovan,
O'Donovan, which is great. So it's kind of a book where it's pretty quickly into it. I realized, okay, yeah, these are the same people I find very helpful too. So I knew I was going to enjoy
Charles
it.
Taylor's in there.
Taylor.
Jamie Smith a little bit.
Little Smith, but O'Donovan probably as much as anyone, I would think. Right at the end of the day, I didn't calculate it.
Well, his ethics, his stuff on ethics is just so brilliant, and of course he has a really strong place for wisdom in his in what he's.
Well, I need to read
overall
more.
project.
I feel like that's an area where I've read some O'Donovan, but certainly not enough, and need to kind of beef that up. But so here's an interesting thing though. So discipleship. So for me, that's a very important idea in light of the Gospels and the call to that. I have a very dear old friend from St. Andrew's Days who's a professor in Michigan, and she's doing a lot of work on discipleship, and she's asked me this question that I don't have an answer for, and I thought I'd stick it to you and see if you don't have an answer.
If you don't have an answer for it, I'm probably not.
No, it's good. No,
it's
I really want to dialogue about it and see if you have some thoughts about it. I've had a few answers to it, but I'm not entirely satisfied. So the question is, so the Gospels obviously use disciple language. That's clearly central. But you actually don't find disciple language in the rest of the New Testament. There are basically little to no references. Like, Paul doesn't call people disciples.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to do with that. And she's asked me that question, and I have some answers, but I'd love to hear your thought. And what made it came to mind for me is that in your chapter, you do an Old Testament background, very, very short, which should be, and then just to keep the book going, you have a New Testament, you have a Gospels background, and then you have a Paul background. And again, what you're doing there is pretty general, but I thought, okay, well, here he says there's eschatological discipleship in Paul. What do you do with the fact that there's actually no language of disciple?
I don't know that terminology necessarily indicates a lack of of
conceptual
understanding.
I totally agree with that.
So,
it's still odd, though, don't you think?
This Is Our Time is a worldview book in some ways. I don't think I ever used that word the entire way through. Not in This Is Our Time.
Oh,
in
no,
here.
sorry, the other way.
In my
Okay,
other
yeah,
way.
sorry,
So
right.
what I'm saying is like I use it here, but I wouldn't use it there. I don't know that it was
For
helpful.
Intentional reasons.
Yeah,
right,
I just
for clarity.
but so.
But could
so,
you really argue that Paul doesn't want to use disciple?
No, but he says, "Follow me as I follow Christ." Like how much more close to discipleship kind of language, "Follow me," can you get than basically echoing the call
Yeah.
that Jesus
Well, I
gives
agree
to his
there.
disciples?
Of course, I agree.
Right?
There's a ton of overlap.
And then when you consider the way he's telling people to live, in light of their time, in light of the gospel, and all of that, there's certainly a formative aspect to what he's.
For sure.
To what he's doing, and the
It's
other.
the same imitative ethic, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting though that he doesn't use.
Yeah, doesn't it strike you as odd? Because it's
and neither does
the
Peter.
Jesus traditions.
Neither does Peter.
That's right. I don't think it's.
But
in the
Peter
epistles
uses
at
the
all.
same imitative ethic too, because he's.
Right.
I mean, even so it's there.
So
Discipleship is there,
What
but I
happens
just don't
to
think
that
they're
language
thinking.
is basically the question. And
That
part
is
of the
really- that
part
is
of the
interesting.
complicating issue is that, as you've probably, I know you've read some of my works, you know what I'm going to argue here. Part of the issue is that you can't even trace an historical connection because the Gospels are after the epistles anyway. So in other words, you can't
That's
just
right.
say, well, Jesus
That's right,
called
that's
disciples,
right.
and then the early church
Said
decides for
apostles.
X
We'll call
whatever
them-
reasons, apostles, and then, but of course there is language that changes. You have brother and sister, household of God. So you do have a bunch of other metaphors, but
That's right.
disciple goes away. But the problem is you can't make a trajectory argument, which could be
Right.
interesting because the Gospels themselves are after the epistles.
So it's like
And
it's like the authors come back to
because I assume that was in the Jewish tradition that he was calling disciples.
but they come back to that tradition when they do the Gospels,
Right,
when
but
they
then
write
why
out the
is it
Gospels.
all the more? Why is it
But
not in
Paul
the epistles?
doesn't use that language.
Or Peter, or anybody.
Is it
It's very weird.
because that the disciples were so clearly focused with as the apostles that actually walked and talked with Jesus, and that like
I wonder. That's
but,
one thought
but
that's crossed my mind.
that doesn't make sense then at the end of Matthew that the Great Commission would be to make more. Right?
That's right.
So,
Yeah. That is the Great Commission.
Okay, so
right?
what's your answer?
Well,
now
I'm
that you've
still
thought about it
exploring.
longer than I
Yeah,
have.
that's
so-
true. Fair enough. So conceptually, I think clearly there is overlap. One thought that has crossed my mind is that during Jesus' day, discipleship language makes a lot of sense, especially because Jesus is being presented as a sage or a philosopher in the Gospels. I feel very strongly, or a rabbi. I mean, which comes from that same tradition, which is a teacher who calls people to follow so that they might learn how to see and be in the world. That's how I define it.
Right.
So that's clearly that language, maybe disciple language, works better when the sage is there and you've got this kind of physical following,
Rather than
as
afterwards.
opposed to. Which, again, maybe you could still use that to argue that even though the Gospels postdate the epistles for the most part in terms of their production, it would still make sense for that language that fits with the physical following. I'm not entirely satisfied with that, but I think part of the answer too
Really interesting.
might be that, and again, this isn't perfect, but the epistles are written very clearly in a Greco-Roman paranetic genre. Like almost all the epistles are paranesis. That is, they are moral instruction
Yes.
to form people in a certain way, right? And so you can see the parallels in Seneca and all out. It's clearly paranetic literature. James, First Peter, most of the epistles are as
Which
well.
is about the formation.
Right. Which is about the formation of
moral
people.
formation.
Exactly. And so because they are written from and into a mixed Jewish, Greek, Jewish Gentile church situation, I can't help but wonder if it makes sense that the natural genre for that is paranesis. And paranesis isn't going to use disciple as much as it's going to use all these other metaphors, household of God. You have the household
You have
codes.
so many images
Right.
of the church that do show up in the epistles.
Right. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's
and
as
they're
far as
into
I've got.
communities. They're into communities generally.
That's right.
Not
Yeah.
to individual people for the
Yep,
most part.
there's that as well.
So
Yep.
I'm not saying that would mean you wouldn't use disciple language, but
Yeah. So as far as I've got, I don't know. Beyond that, it's still perplexing to me.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
I had not. I hadn't really noticed the absence.
you saying it had its origins in your dissertation also makes sense then of why, for me, the good discussion of the Enlightenment, which I really appreciated because I care very much about the effect of the Enlightenment on hermeneutics and the church. This has been one of my big concerns for the last 20
And it
years.
has an eschatology. There's no
That's
question.
right. Yeah.
of
So
that.
I really appreciated the idea of alternative
Rival
eschatologies that are being offered. That's really helpful. And that's where Charles Taylor and others and O'Donovan are very helpful as well. Have you read yet Alan Jacobs' Year of Our Lord, 1943?
No, I've got it on my wish
my
list.
goodness.
Is it so good?
It's so good.
I read everything Alan Jacobs writes, and
rightly
that's
so, yeah.
that's one that I haven't gotten yet.
Well, it
but
made me
I've got
think
it
of
on
it.
my wish list for Amazon. I'm just
Yeah. Well, it's not cheap. The problem is I bought it
Oh,
on
is it?
SBL because
Oh, is
it's
it?
OUP,
Okay.
so it's
Oh,
not
yeah,
cheap.
yeah.
But the alternative eschatologies made me think of it because, as you'll see when you read the book, that basically Auden, Lewis, Eliot, Simone Weil, all of them were wrestling with what is the world going to look like, and how should Christians try to impact society after this
the war.
amazing war is over?
Right.
What your book is saying, and you'll love the Jacobs book because it is Broadway, all right?
yeah. This is
the
definitely
thing.
downtown Nashville.
Yeah, we're getting it. I've walked this with
There's
my wife.
the Johnny Cash Museum.
Okay,
right there.
Oh, there's Russ Moore standing outside of it.
Yeah.
Right. I was going to ask him how many times he's been there. Right.
And there's the Goo Goo shop. Goo Goo clusters they're a Nashville thing as well.
I didn't realize that. Okay. Yeah. Okay, very good. Anyways, I wasn't trying to divert away from your book. I was just saying that
I gotta get that book.
I like the idea of helping people think about alternative eschatologies that are being offered. It just made me think of that was happening in the 1940s as well. And these great Christian thinkers that we both admire, I know, and many others do.
They were wrestling with that.
They were really wrestling with that. Especially they were concerned about technology. That's what's really striking, is that it's kind of made Lewis make more sense, because I've read Lewis for 25 years now and enjoyed him. But like his science fiction trilogy, which is so great, it's making more sense to me in light of Jacob's book, because what Lewis was constantly worried about World War II was that technology afterwards was going to take over. It's like, okay, that's exactly what he's dealing with in those books, and how much more now. I mean, that's what's crazy about it. I really appreciated also your insight that both the sexual revolution and the consumerist eschatologies, or sexualist revolution and consumerist options, are really functions of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
You want to say something more about that? I thought that
Well,
was really
I treat them in three different chapters as if they're three different eschatologies.
But you say that. No, but you pointed out.
But I say because I think their manifestations are important to deal with on their own.
Totally, yeah.
But that you really could say that both consumerism and sexual revolution, you could even say those two things are related, but that they're really they're stemming from the Enlightenment view of progress in history, and that
and humanism to some degree.
Yes, and humanism. So you've got, I think it's important for us to recognize how sexual revolution, why that eschatology is so strong in the West when it's not as strong in the East, in Eastern cultures.
Say something about that.
The idea though that as we cast off more moral restraints and prohibitions and taboos from the past, that is necessarily a sign of our liberation and our growing enlightenment and all of that. That has an amazing amount of cultural sway today. I mean, just think about documentaries on television or about media. So, the first of this in a movie, or the first of that in a TV show, or the first because it's like, oh, that's groundbreaking because it's actually part of the liberation, right?
Right. There was one little section that I didn't disagree with, but
it would be more interesting if you disagree.
Well, I'm going
to
push you a little bit.
You might change my mind.
No, I actually don't disagree. It just, you say something that most people say that gives me a little pause that I wonder if it'll lead to something else. Okay. And that is,
I say lots of things that give myself pause, so I'm curious.
You say that one problem is recasting Christianity as a means of self-fulfillment.
Yes.
And then you talk about what a lot of Christians have talked about in recent years, the
moralistic therapeutic
deism, which is obviously, by that phrasing, is a bad thing, or whatever, which it is, I agree. Okay, my concern is, as you might imagine, in light of my own last 10 years of a journey towards the idea of human flourishing as the end of Christianity, the goal that is, that I'm a little allergic to people, Christians, raising concerns about self-fulfillment as a necessary evil. My allergy is that I think for a lot of people, what the sensibility that's actually driving that is a non-biblical sensibility, which is Kantian deontologicalism, right? They don't realize it because it sounds so good to say Christianity is about self-denial and Christianity is about sacrifice, which it is, but those things are not understood in biblical terms as being anti-human flourishing.
Man, we don't disagree.
You know what I mean?
We don't disagree on this at all.
I didn't think you did, but my
so-
concern is whenever people talk that way, I get a little, scared because, and maybe part of my trigger is that I never answer any internet trolls, and I don't get very many internet trolls actually, but a lot of people have said a lot of nice things about the Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing book, which is very kind, but very rarely you'll get some crotchety old, and this happened last year.
It's not about flourishing or about happiness.
It's like, the last thing we need is another Joel Osteen book or something.
Right.
Well, obviously the person they admitted they had not read the book. Obviously, I'm not arguing for your best life now. I mean, my point is the Macrisms say that suffering is the route. And, it's all that. But my point is that kind of sensibility is very common in Christianity because of the influence of deontological Kantianism and everything.
Almost like if you're
says.
enjoying your life, you can't be faithful.
Exactly.
You can't be okay. No,
and so you're not saying that, but whenever people talk about therapeutic moral, I always get but hold on, be careful, don't go too far.
Well, I just finished this blog series on expressive individualism,
right?
In which I talked about I talked about how for many people, the church becomes simply a means of self-fulfillment, right? Or it becomes simply a means of them finding, or the church helping you become the best version of the you that you think you ought to be, or helping you along the path you've chosen for yourself, which is certainly not what the Sermon on the Mount is about. But
some of that language I think is helpful, actually.
Here's what I would say. So what is actually important, what a lot of Christians do, and I even mentioned this as one of the temptations that we have in this age, it's to so go against self-fulfillment that we actually, and to emphasize self-denial, and I say this in one of the blog posts where I'm unpacking kind of more what's in here, that we forget the fact that self-denial is actually in pursuit of a greater self-fulfillment.
Exactly.
Like
that is not self-denial is not a virtue.
No, self-denial.
It's not. It's a negativity.
In other religions, in certain levels, will push self-denial. But self-denial is in pursuit of a greater joy. So it's actually in pursuit of happiness and fulfillment. And I mean, it's even Jesus's denial and going to the cross was for the joy set before him.
Exactly. So that's my concern, right?
Yeah. So I mentioned that the temptation we have, I think, in an age, and I think that this is kind of coming up against your. I don't think you should be that allergic to kind of the pushback against self-fulfillment as the end-all and be-all, but you're right. The temptation would be, the way that we counter this age of self-fulfillment or moralistic therapeutic deism is to only preach self-denial.
That's my concern.
If it's not connected to the deeper longing. So if there is the longing for fulfillment and for happiness, then you've got to show how the world's way does not deliver what it is you're ultimately wanting, but God's way does. Like that's the. And
that was the genius of Piper, way back. Early
this
Piper.
is hedonism, Christian hedonism.
I don't like that term because I think the philosophical term of hedonism is against the virtue
tradition. Well, a lot of people don't like that term, but
that was the genius of early Piper.
It's for joy.
All right, envelope, random question. We'll wrap it up with this.
In any envelope?
Any envelope, you choose your color. We won't judge you. Nice. Okay.
Well, I just picked it. I wasn't really looking carefully here.
So you'll answer the question, then I will too. I don't know what to think.
You're starting a band tomorrow. What's the name? I was in a band. No, I was in a band. What was the name of my band? I don't know. What would your band name be?
Oh, I'm gonna fail too.
You need more time.
That's a hard one.
You've got to get together with a marketing group and have a branding conversation.
That's the solution. We will form a committee and
we'll
decide
have a marketing
what
conversation.
Would be the best one.
Yeah.
Crucified Pussycats? I don't know. Something like that.
Probably not.
I don't know. We'll definitely strike that one for the record. Yeah, we'll form a committee and we will join. We'll start a band together.
What other questions do you have in here?
I don't know. But you can only answer one.
We can't?
All right, go. No,
I didn't really answer that one because I don't.
All right, that's fine. We'll do another one. No one's ever had the boldness to open a second envelope. Come on. All right,
best invention ever made.
Okay. Hopefully the battery won't die.
Best invention ever made. I'm hard pressed to say something other than air conditioning
Oh, that's a good one.
because I lived without it in Romania. So it's like, yeah.
I'm going to say the internet. If that's an
Okay,
invention.
yeah. The internet's an invention. Al
Right.
Gore, right?
Yeah,
Al Gore
thankfully,
invented
I'm
it?
very thankful for him and the interweb.
Yeah.
So,
That's a
yeah,
yeah.
air conditioning's pretty good though too.
Air conditioning,
right?
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
just think if we had the internet but not air conditioning, we would be hot and sweaty on the phone and on the computer
Right.
all the time. But if we had air conditioning without internet, I'm still going to stick with air conditioning.
Hey, one more shout out to B&H Publishing for sponsoring this episode. Down below in the show notes, you'll find links to all the books we talked about. And don't forget to subscribe to our CCT YouTube channel. Thanks. Peace out.
Car